Right, so this is, how can I check this one in? I'm currently standing outside the church at Crowhurst, dedicated to St George. Now Crowhurst is just about 3 miles south from a place called Battle, which is reputed to be the site of the Battle of Hastings. Now, there is some controversy about this because a book was written about the Battle of Hastings, stating that it didn't actually happen on the site that we historically think it did. They said it happened here. And there's an old yew tree that stands in the grounds of the church, which is at least 1300 years old. I would have been here at the same time that Harold's manor would have stood in this area. And it's obvious that the Normans had to take this route to get to what is the site of the Battle of Hastings. Now, there's a couple of weird sort of coincidences here. So this historian thinks that the tree that's on the Bay of Tapestry, where there's a parley between Harold and William, is this tree that stands in the churchyard. And the site actually has all of the significant bits historically of the woodland and the sort of river that runs to one side, and it obviously is quite hilly here. Now, interestingly for me, I've always been a bit, I don't know, there's something about the sighting of Battle Abbey, which is where, reputedly was the Battle of Hastings, that didn't make sense. Like, the hill wasn't the sort of formidable hill that you would sight an army on. Whereas here, there's lots of things in the landscape that looks like the type of thing you would have done. And because it was actually Harold's land, he knew it like the back of his hand, which again makes sense of this being the site. Now, standing here and just getting the vibe of the land, there's a couple of very weird things about this place. And one of them is the fact that it's dedicated to St George. And of course, St George is the patron saint, our patron saint, but of course it was imported by the Normans. It wasn't our idea to have, if it was left to the Anglo-Saxons, it would have been something like St Cuthbert. But that's one thing. Now, of course, St George is a warrior saint, which makes sense, doesn't it? Normally depicted on being on horseback and slaying dragons, obviously. But in the churchyard, there's this other very unusual aspect to this, which is one of these sort of synchronicitous things that I always like to sort of reflect on. And it's the fact that, of course, this is a location of a Commonwealth war graves, and it's right at the front of the church as you're going up the hill. And of course, it belongs to the Diocese of Chichester. So that's interesting that there's a war grave at the site where somebody is saying that this was the site of the Battle of Hastings. Interesting energy, that. Another point is that definitely Edith Swanneck, who was Harold's lover, who was the only one to be able to recognise him from a mark that was only known to her, recognised his butchered body, is buried at Bosham village, which is in right next to Chichester, and it's possible that Harold is buried there as well. So there we go. Lots of very interesting twists and turns to this story. From a sort of common sense point of view, I would say, as I'm climbing up a hill, it sort of makes sense that this could be the battlefield, and not Senlac Hill. And of course we've got to remember that if this was the site of the battle, obviously a lot of things have changed. The general topography would be the same, of course. You wouldn't really want a site consecrated to the person that you'd killed, because apart from anything else, it would be a place for people to effectively go on pilgrimage to. So if you wanted to not have descent to your reign, you certainly wouldn't build a monastery exactly on the spot that Harold was killed, interestingly, would you? As being the main place. You might build something, and there is an abbey here, which would have fulfilled William the Bastard's promise that he would build an abbey. But the one that you cited as being the abbey would be somewhere that effectively you would not be being able to do any magical rites to. Because again, if you think about a mass, a Catholic mass, people could literally go there and pray to the wrong person, if you get my drift. So there's a whole bunch of reasons in that type of medieval thinking or early medieval thinking that doesn't make sense for Battle Abbey to be the place where the battle was. Interestingly. So I'm now standing on a hill which, all of this looks like perfect terrain to sign an army. And they're lovely hills. Not easy for cavalry to charge up wherever you wanted to site your army. Yeah, very, very, very interesting. Very interesting indeed. Okay, so I'm walking up towards Battle. We have an interesting thing in British history. Obviously we're quite battle orientated in our sort of historical knowledge. But of course there aren't that many battles on British soil apart from internal squabbles, apart from obviously Hastings. Although of course there were other people who laid claim to the throne. There were French incursions, of course, which we very rarely read about. But obviously all along this coastline are the sink ports, or the sunk ports, I suppose you should call it, which would say there'll be 5 ports, but of course there's actually more. I can't remember how many, maybe about 7 or 8. One of them being Winchelsea, which is not far from here. And Winchelsea was taken over by the French a couple of times for a couple of days, and so on. So there was a lot of backwards and forwards as raids and stuff like that, which we don't really hear much about in the history books. And we certainly don't hear much about how we lost eventually all the French possessions that we had originally. So this brings me to the sort of thing about what we know as our story. May not be the true story. So this thing about the Battle of Hastings and the sighting of it may not be accurate, and there's no way of telling, because obviously we only get one person's story from this. What is quite fascinating about English history of this period, although we think, the Anglo-Saxons, we think about Alfred and, unifying the country, which of course he didn't actually do. A lot of the recapturing of English territory, and of course it wasn't just Anglo-Saxon territory, because it was before the Danes came. We had different kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia and Northumbria and stuff like that. And of course, what the Danes actually managed to accomplish was that they managed to annihilate certain aspects of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So when Harold's grandchildren sort of started to take back territory, it became more unified instead of it being these squabbling Anglo-Saxon nations. But of course, a lot of the kings that we think about as being English or Saxon kings, some of them were actually Norse, Canute being one of them. And of course we sort of forget about that, because that's not written into the history. So by the time William took England, Harold had already dispatched one of his main contenders to the crown, which was Harold Hardrada, who was probably the most brilliant warrior of his time. But yes, so the Battle of Stamford Bridge meant that was the end of William's main contender for the British crown. And so in a way, that particular year, 1066, was incredibly complex, and I don't think it was just here. I think it was Europe generally. It was a complex period of time. Yeah. So let's sort of have a think about that. See, the narrative that we accept is obviously not necessarily true, and is only a story, somebody's story. The complexity of the story, of the true story, we probably would never know, because a lot of it wouldn't have been written down, and so we're just left with the general narrative. So we've only got to look at things today, what's the story we're being told, and who's telling it to us. So returning to the idea of a narrative, we can sort of look at, I'm just walking past a place called Norman's Wood, which is interesting. There's actually a house, but there's a lot of woods here, and obviously a lot of this area would have been wooded. In fact, lots of the names of the places here refer to woodland, because a hurst was a wood in Anglo-Saxon. So Crowhurst, I'm assuming, would have been a woodland full of crows. It sort of makes sense, doesn't it? But there we go. So anyway, narratives. So it made me reflect, actually looking at this church, how Christianity is so tied up with conflict and warfare, and how you can have a just war and a crusade and all the rest of it. And to me, that is just so illogical. So it makes you sort of ponder how you could make something like Christianity or even Buddhism slot into that, or even Jainism is another good one, slot into the situation of warfare, as you know, their main sort of tenets is that of peace, and even Islam, of course. How that can be justified, particularly when it becomes the main religion of a culture, as it did for the Romans. Obviously, Emperor Constantine the First of Rome was the one who adopted Christianity as the main religion of Rome. But by all accounts, he was quite happy to sort of mix and match some of his ideas, and he was quite a ruthless man, putting it mildly. So to square his Christian beliefs and stuff with his behaviour, and obviously we have to put it in context. He was the emperor of Rome, or of Eastern Rome anyway, Constantinople, which obviously bears his name. I'm walking past a really lovely garden here with lots of art, lots of sculptures, and some of them are quite interesting because some bits of radiators, household radiators and car hubcaps. But there's a praying mantis made of wood, some sculptures of figures contemplating, sort of like a Rodin type figure, in this sort of glade. It's very lovely. So, we're carrying up the hill. So, I don't know whether this is the hill that might have been the site of the Harold's army. I don't know, it's difficult to say. Right, so talking about narratives, so it's interesting how that story could be spun. That somebody who was a pacifist, anti-establishment figure such as Christ, or I should say Jesus, could then become part. There's another interesting synchronicity here. I'm just walking past Crowhurst Christian Healing Centre. So there we go. Amazing. I didn't even know this was here. yeah, how that could become that you could raise armies in order to take the cause of Christ forward. How does that make sense? It's incredible, isn't it? So, looking at stories then. So what narrative are you living to? The sort of creative narrative of your own life. Is there any stories you want to include in your own life about your ability to love, your ability to be loved? And could that become part of your artistic endeavours, you know? I remember somebody saying, it was actually, I think it was Stuart Ward, he was talking about the Beatles, and he said that they mentioned the word love in their songs more than anyone else. And I think that's pretty much the case, particularly as a couple of the songs are just repeat the word love over and over again. And I think they knew a thing or two about language and how language could be used as a way of changing people's consciousness, changing the sort of zeitgeist. Because certainly that period, you know, the summer of love and all that sort of stuff, it all ties into how, you know, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album comes out. Just generally the whole mood of the world changed for a short period of time, even though of course we had some horrendous things going on in the world. It was most notably the Vietnam War. Yeah, so interesting. So I'm sort of still climbing this hill, interestingly, towards Battle. We're still going up this hill. So reflecting on this thing about narrative, I think the first thing about narrative is to understand that there is one. There is a story. Somebody's written it. It's not you. You know, who are you? So there's another little aspect to this which I thought I'd bring into the mix. My father, who's no longer with us, grew up in sort of Brighton and Lewis, and then became a professional soldier for virtually all of his working life. And he was an older man when he had me. So he was born in 1910, and he was in the army by the time he was 14 or 15 years of age, and obviously lied about his age and all the rest of it. And within a couple of years he was in Alexandria, and of course we had an empire then, so that must have been quite an exciting thing for a young guy. Now, he always said that his parents, described his parents, and that his mother died just before the day before he left school and all the rest of it. And he had a favourite brother called Charlie. So he didn't get on with anyone else in the family. There's a lot of big family, youngest of 13, and didn't say much about his father. And I wasn't particularly interested, obviously, you know, I didn't get on with my father very well. So I didn't really quiz him about anything. He'd said that there were Irish roots within the family and all the rest of it. Anyway, a few years ago I started looking at my sort of ancestry, and I discovered that most of this was not true. It was all a lie. Now, I'm not sure how much he knew, because basically his mother had him out of wedlock. She passed him over to the family that he was brought up in, who were not called the Highlands. They were called the Rubridges. And the people he spoke about as his father and mother were actually possibly his grandfather and grandmother. And his beloved brother, Charlie, was actually his dad. So what we can assume is that Charlie was in love with a lady called Lottie Highland, and she became pregnant. Great disgrace to both families. Lottie then, we know that she moved up towards sort of Norfolk, then married and had a family. He, and this must have been part of the deal, was given over to Charlie's family, who brought him up. Charlie went into the Navy, so he was really more or less looked after by his grandmother and grandfather. My father said that what he said was his mother died the day before he left school, but apparently she didn't. According to the death records, she lived for another 3 or 4 years. So, not sure what was going on in that family, but the Highlands came from this area. So it came from, I'm in Crowhurst, a few miles away from here is Westfield and Settlescombe. So they're all in this area. If you go to Rye, there's a place called Highlands Place, which is in the actual town of Rye. There's a nice little tea room there. And strangely, in another recording that I did, I was out walking again. I was sort of more or less still walking the old way, but this is a slight deviation from it. I went into a little church, and there was a picture of some people after they renovated this particular church near Wilmington in Sussex. There were some people from the photograph taken from around about 1990, and they were the Highlands with an S on the end, so not sure how close we are, but you know, Highland is not that common a name. So that brings me to that sort of thing again of, you know, how you could be drawn to a place. This is quite common actually. I've seen this happen a couple of times with people where they like particular places and they find actually there's some ancestral link with it. This is true with Lewis actually. My daughter really liked Lewis before she knew that my father used to live there. So yeah, interesting. So this area for me is strange because I'm actually slightly ambivalent about Sussex, because I tend to like the people from Kent more. If you can be that xenophobic, I don't know. It's just there's something about the people that I've always thought in the past the sort of people from Kent were a little bit more spit and sawdust. the little bit more practical, say it as it is type of characters. Whereas Sussex tends to have a lot of quite well-heeled places down here. There's lots of old sort of estates where somebody who lives in the manor house still owns all the houses in the village. That's certainly true with some of the places down on the downs, Glyndebourne being one of them, Glynde, Firle. There's a dead fox in the road. There's quite a lot of dead badgers actually, not so many foxes, a lot of deer. Lots of dead deer. They tend to like crossing the road. About stories, narrative, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories that are told to us that we take as gospel, tying in the religious aspect of things, and of course they're not. They're sort of myths, which then you think, well, maybe we should be writing our own stories here, creating our own myths about what we believe to be our story, the things that make our lives better and more interesting. Right, so with that, not sure quite when this will come out because I've got quite a lot of interviews that are happening at the moment, and I tend to use these as when it seems to be sort of valid or when there's a little bit of a gap in the sort of scheduling. So stuff on the show notes, hopefully getting the artwork done for the book this week. We'll get some of the ideas together anyway. I've got some lovely people that are helping me out on this stuff, and so that's good. A little bit of photography required this week as well, so yeah, I've got to get my old photogenic spirit up somewhere along the line. So I'm just about climbing up the hill now towards Battle. I'm going to get myself a cup of tea and maybe sort of wander back down. So until I see you next time, wishing you all the very best.